Welcome back. This time we have Babak Hafezi, who is CEO of Hafezi Capital, and adjunct professor at the American University of International Business. And I wanted to talk to him about the effects of Trump tariffs. My first question would be respect to the effects in Europe and China, considering that this is going to it's already many or already are foreseeing a recession in Europe, especially in Germany, because of these tariffs, which will, I guess, isolate the United States in the long term, right?
Yes, so the Europeans are actually much more delicate in the tariffs. They are very dependent on the United States for trade, and if you look at many different sectors, the wine sector as an example, about 25 to 30% of all wine exports from Europe come to the United States. So they're very dependent in multiple aspects of it. I would argue that it's not purely the tariffs that's making Europe weaker. It is also the effects of the war in Ukraine that has systematically weakened Europe for the past 3 or 4 years. We have the post-COVID pandemic that weakened Europe. That they did get out of it a little later than everybody else did, but they got out of COVID. And eventually, what ended up happening is the war in Ukraine and the cheap energy that was coming from Russia, especially to Germany, ended up really hampering their ability to compete globally. And that has been the perils of the European economic crisis in a sense.
Yes, but the it's true. It's just 21% of European exports go to the United States, and yet that could represent 2% of GDP. And that, considering the effects of, as you mentioned, the the effects of the war of Ukraine in Ukraine, and besides that, the effects of the Merkel era, because there was, because of their obsession with balanced budgets, they neglected many of the investments that are right now having a heavier toll than energy prices, right? Um, the question is also the effects on China. So
Right. So I don't see China as at the same boat as Europe in any way. I think China after 2016, they understood that their trade policies with the developed world were at jeopardy. And I think that China actually ended up pivoting in between 2016, 17, 18, 19, 20. And when China saw that the Biden administration had the same kind of continuous policies and not in certain elements worse tariff policies, especially on EVs, that China ended up pivoting and started focusing on the developing world. And I think that China right now does not see itself as being in a position where it is going to get affected as much as the other countries that trade principally with the United States.
especially in the long term, because they are
Yeah.
moving aggressively to out. But in the short term, it's still going to be felt. The effect is it's still going to be felt.
100%. It's going to be felt, but it's not going to be, in 2017, 18, it would have been a crash of the economy.
Mhm.
I think in 2025, it is an economic bump. So the severity of it is much less today than it would have been 9 years ago.
Many think that, well, that may be a good thing because that will open other options like Vietnam, but that's actually an illusion because the Asian economy is very integrated, and
Yes.
that's what makes even less credible the long-term perspectives of the Vietnam deal Trump has announced with that 20% tariff, right?
Right. So Vietnam became the de facto trade partner as a displacement trade partner with the US after 2018. If you look at how much imports we actually brought from Vietnam between 2018 and up until 2024, it actually increased dramatically. And one of the key reasons is because Chinese companies ended up opening up operations in Vietnam and moving production facilities. So there was this made in Vietnam element. So this trace displacement that was happening is something the United States is trying to stop. They learned their lessons and they want to stop that. So I do not believe that Vietnam is going to be de facto a good trading partner for the U.S. for this specific reason, because it's still a a key trading partner with China.
And let me just clarify something. Uh, Trump threatened Vietnam with 40% tariffs in case of the use of Chinese components.
Right.
Does that include the components produced inside Vietnam with Chinese capitals?
Yes. I mean, here's the thing. Nobody knows what that policy is because that policy hasn't been clarified. The literal aspects of these trade policies is they're ad hoc, they're developed overnight, and there is no clear path forward as to where they want to go. So we don't know, is it the capital? Is it parts? Is it raw resources? I mean, what are we talking about? Is it how much human capital is produced in one country? There is no way to analyze this cohesively, and there's no policy that has been designed to address these elements. One day it could be one thing, the next day it could be something else.
Yeah, one thing that increases uncertainty, as not even Smoot-Hawley did in the 1930s, is this backs and forth, these capricious changes of mood, like for instance, what happened in Brazil,
Mhm.
because it has nothing to do with trade. It's just that because he wants to force a sovereign country to drop the charges on Bolsonaro, who tried to topple the government of the newly elected government of Lula da Silva, right?
100%. The sad part is we actually have a trade surplus with Brazil. So we actually gain in that process. And if you look at it, the damage that the administration has done to companies that they're actually good for us. For example, we have a trade surplus in airplane part sales, but we have tariffs on that as well. So it's like, why would you damage the industries that we actually are already winning in? So this is the lack of cohesiveness of the trade policy and trade strategy and transparency.
Yeah, man, there's an interesting point I want to get back to in a minute, but before, there seems to be a good news, in all this is that the projected lower demand, the lower activity worldwide, it is going to imply lower energy prices, and that's affecting already the Russian economy, right?
Yes and no. I don't necessarily think that this is a long-term element. If you think of the energy demands for AI, not just domestically but globally, we're talking about a multiple increase in energy production globally, and that's necessary in the next
Mhm.
decade. And one of the elements of competition and being able to compete globally is, do you have enough energy for AI to work? Right. So I actually do not believe that maybe in the short term, yes, prices will go down and Russia will be affected. But I think that the long term of it, we're actually going to see continuous increase in prices, especially in anything related to electric manufacturing.
Yeah, that's good to make that distinction, because the among the few institutions that have certain independence still in Russia is the central bank. And the central
Right.
bank for a long time resisted Putin's pressure to lower interest rates. Now it has finally lowered interest rates because precisely of that expectation of lower prices but it's we must clarify, it's in the short term.
Right. It's up. So these elements are short-term, transitory, I would argue. I think that there's yet to. One of the things that we still don't know from a geopolitical issue is that is the issue with of Israel and Iran over? It is very, very possible that in the next 3 to 4 months, if not shorter period of time, that there's more continuous attacks between the two countries. And this time it could be actually much more deeper, much more and threatened global industry. So we could see very quickly overnight oil prices surging.
Yeah, and that will be self-inflicted because if we analyze a little bit, what happened in Iran is that they destroyed or possibly destroyed enrichment facilities. Yet the most important factors in nuclear enrichment is the know-how that is pretty much intact, and the uranium that is, it seems was removed from these enrichment facilities before the attacks. So the only difference now is that the International Atomic Agency inspectors are out of Iran.
Correct. And that creates multiple levels of threats, right? Because the West does not know what is going on internally, number one. And number two, it also has made the IAEA kind of a political organization more than anything else than a third party. So I think that their activities and what they have been doing in the past year has weakened them more than anything else as an institution. And it's going to take them many, many decades to come back from this.
And not just that, is that the every time Netanyahu makes a charge against Iran that about enrichment of uranium, Iran can deny it. And the only way you can make sure is with boots on the ground because
Right.
you don't have inspectors. So
Right.
the situation is much worse than before.
100%. There's less clarity and less transparency. And to a certain degree, there was success during the Obama era in terms of understanding what the enrichment was and limiting it and knowing where it went. That is no longer there.
Now I wanted to move a little bit to this administration's industrial policy, if you can call it that, because it's based in a fantasy. If we base on the Plaza Accords of 1986, but if you see the numbers, you see that the Plaza Accords is true improved manufacturing exports, but manufacturing it had no effect on manufacturing activity. The trend before 1986 was the same trend as after 96, and the 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 participation of manufacturing in GDP and especially in employment kept falling in the next years. So, and unfortunately, this administration is basing their industrial policy on that fantasy. Is that correct?
So I think that they actually do not have a policy per se. Their only policy that they have, based on what I've seen and all the resources that they've put out, is predominantly tax cuts, and that giving enough tax cuts to corporations will fuel investments in their activities,
Yeah, that or that.
which has been proven to be kind of not true, right? Because it leads predominantly to share buybacks. That's what the activities happen. It does not lead to more investment. So I actually do not think that they actually have an industrial policy, as I say. And the industrial policy they have is mostly the threat of tariffs. If you don't move production back home, we will tariff you. Well, the alternative is that people will choose tariffs because tariffs are still cheaper than moving manufacturing back to the United States because the cost of manufacturing and the timeline to manufacture is so long. So I don't believe they actually have a cohesive industrial policy per se.
Yeah, no, the industrial policy is just tariffs,
Right. Yeah.
and that has no effect beyond the very short term and only in sports. That's what happened in 1980 after 1986.
Right.
Yet, there are two constraints that are normally ignored. That is the uncertainty associated to tariffs don't allow you in most industries to plan expansion of capacity, new investment. Uh,
Absolutely true. So yeah, so you're limiting both new investment. You're also limiting R&D, and what you're doing is figuring out. You're continuously changing your supply chain because you're being reactive to the market rather than proactive. So it forces corporations to be always on a reactive mode rather than invest for long term, and that actually limits growth domestically.
Not just that is that in the short term that implies that they are not in the capacity of replacing imports, and so all the companies that all the businesses that are associated in that to them in the supply chain also suffer.
100%. But there could be an argument made, and if you look at President Trump's statements, there could be an argument made that one of the goals of this administration is to decrease consumption. And this trade policy does that very effectively, right? If you look at it, what their policy has been in terms of tariffs and how much tariffs they're putting on, the only alternative that happens is that the prices go up so much that you have complete destruction of demand in certain categories.
So you and in
So
the end you have a smaller economy with higher prices.
correct, correct. And for whatever reason, they believe that this policy is a correct policy. So, but that is the policy that they're implementing today is to destroy consumption for a very large segment of the population in the United States, especially the people who are most financially marginalized.
Yes, small businesses that have no pricing power,
Correct,
consumers that are less informed, and that I guess are the ones that are pushing the numbers on consumption down.
correct. Yeah, I mean, if you look at anybody who is not upper middle class, where their paychecks are very, very tight already, what's going to end up happening is they're going to be able to afford less products. They're going to have less consumption that goes on. Well, this completely affects the entire supply chain. This impacts every single aspect of the supply chain, all the way from from shipping to raw commodities to every element associated with that. And then also it's impacting choice because you will have less choice. If you have one or two productions countries, you have less choice in terms of quality, and you create natural protections in the domestic economy against that.
That brings me to the point of the labor market. For many times, especially during the Biden era, it was predicted that the market, labor market was cooling down, and it wasn't cooling down. Uh, there have been signs, the same signs as we have had in the last year. And that was why is that important? Because if the cooling market this time, if the labor market this time doesn't cool down, the Federal Reserve is not going to cut interest rates. And if it doesn't cut interest rates, the effects of the tariffs is going to be magnified. And the sectors that are in critical condition, like commercial real estate or debt itself, may end up exploding because they are basing their expectation of lower interest rates so they can reprice their assets in better terms. But if that's not happening,
So a few things. I actually think that there's certain segments of the labor market that has that is dramatically shrunk. And if we look at it in the past year and a half, in the past year to 18 months, the largest segment of the market that has lost their jobs is white collar Americans, especially in tech. And the numbers that I've seen equates this to the worst job market since 2001 for white collar workers. So we are in that high end area, we are seeing massive amounts of softness. And now in the areas that we're seeing increased jobs, it's in the lower end in hospitality, which are laggers, right? Because they were the laggers of being able to get employment after COVID. And it took some time to open up. So that area is sustainable. I do believe that there's certain sectors of the economy that are already in recession, as you mentioned, real estate. In certain markets, both commercial and residential interest real estate have entered recessionary elements. So we also have in other aspects of construction is also entering that. So we're seeing the supply chain of that happening with a big beautiful bill. We can also see that things, for example, like hospitals and medical healthcare could also enter recessionary periods, especially given the fact that we're cutting Medicaid, excuse me, for such a substantial amount of people. It's going to affect about 1,880 hospitals, suburban hospitals in the United States. Those are all high-paying jobs, all the way from nurses to doctors. So those will have to come into the other economy. So we could see a stagflationary economy in the next few years if these policies are, continue the same way they have been done currently.
Yes, but it would be fair to say that unless the scenario of a stagflation, that is inflation plus recession, would materialize, but only if the labor market stays strong. Because otherwise, the most vulnerable are going to end up absorbing the effects of tariffs.
Correct. So I would argue that that employment is a lagging indicator, right? And so that we are already starting to see the effects of joblessness even on the blue collar, just regular employment. If you look at the number of full-time hours are decreasing, they're shrinking. We're seeing also to a certain degree that the paychecks are not going up as much as they used to. So in that effect, in a sense, you have inflation still sticking strong, but you don't have employment dollars per hour actually increasing. So again, consumption is going to be decreasing. I actually do believe that we are in a process in the next quarter to two to start seeing unemployment become a factor in the economy.
Mhm. But that precisely wouldn't reduce the chances of stagflation.
No, 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 no. But stagflation, if you see things like increased prices based on tariffs, if you see things like lack of supply in the market space, which, the way we're going about, that's going to become an element of lack of supply. If you start seeing that unemployment goes substantially higher, all those elements could lead to stagflation or elements of stagflation.
Even if the labor market cools down.
Yes. Because don't forget, there's another element that's also really, really critically important is that automation is going to become a critical factor in the next um, few years. Maybe not next year, but in the next 2 to 7 years, automation is going to become a critical factor, not just in terms of low labor, but also high-end labor as well. Automations is going to be an element. Anybody in entry-level jobs could be threatened. So we have major obstacles, economic obstacles, that could change the nature of our economy, the way that going forward.
And it's very concerning because that may happen in as soon as 5 years from now. And
Even sooner. I mean, for example, one of the biggest things that McDonald's is rolling out is complete automated restaurants, right? Where the fries, every single thing that was human centric is no longer human centric and is machine centric. So you could technically run a McDonald's with two employees, right?
uh,
Now you multiply that. You multiply that through the entire restaurant hospitality chain. You multiply that in manufacturing. I mean, manufacturing has been the first one that had automation implemented, but you even scale it even higher. That could be a massive change in how humans in jobs and job availability to most Americans.
And that's very concerning because artificial intelligence is going to eliminate white collar jobs. Added to automation, that's going to eliminate also blue collar jobs. The
Correct.
Federal Reserve is going to have lower tools because the effect of monetary policy is going to be seriously diminished. And
It's
on the other
policy.
side, you have
Yeah.
that Trump's budget policies have decimated fiscal policy. In other words, any relief that, if necessary, would have to come from more expensive debt.
Right. And also it's debt that will not actually work well, right? Because you're reaching to the point that you're spending money for the sake of spending money and you're not changing your industrial policy in any meaningful way to have a positive ROI. So it's the worst of what you can do. You're just increasing your debt without actually changing the factors that increase productivity in a meaningful sense and an employment sense. So that those are going to be some challenges. And it's very, very possible that the next phase of tax policy will be taxing machines and not humans because we could be in a scenario where in 10 years the number of humans working is not as much as the number of machines working, so you may have to start taxing machines.
Or something to watch to what Republicans are very resistant, that is taxing wealth, because
Right, but it leads to I mean, ultimately this creates a system that the uberly wealthy become exceptionally successful in this. They have access to capital, they have access to resources, they live a very, very high quality of life with with very low competition, right? Because that's another thing as well. Having machinery, having technology requires a large level of capital investments, and so you create these barriers to entry and moats for most organizations that if you are very, very wealthy and established, you control. You have command and control of economic system in your industry. So that could be the future of us if we do not have good policies to defend that against.
and we would be facing that future with a smaller state with diminished powers when it comes to the watchdogs of the economy, like the FTC, like the Consumer Financial
Right.
Protection Bureau, and others.
Right.
And
There's going to be less. There's going to be less regulation. Obviously, that's what they're moving towards is to remove as much regulation as possible. So if you have less regulation and you have command and control structures for large organizations, they're going to be at a massive competitive advantage that smaller and medium businesses will not be under.
now let me get back a little bit to the short term. Is one thing I have noticed is this the correlation that existed between the dollar index and the treasuries that
Mm.
after Liberation Day was broken, and also the increasing gap between the 10-year and the 30-year treasury that reflects the increasing uncertainty. So we are venturing ourselves with with an experiment based on a fantasy, the Plaza Court, and with no compass, because all the tools like the sum rule, the inverted curve yield and other indicators are not working as before. And so we are venturing in these uncharted waters without a compass, right?
100%. We also have to say that one of the reasons that the inverted yield curve has not actually worked is because we increased the money supply so much during the COVID period. So once we increase the money supply, that the amount of money throughout the system, the slushiness of the amount of money in the system has created a lot of false positives within the data sets. So I believe that, and it will take time for that money to, find its way out of it. However, I do believe that one of the things that has happened, especially since Liberation Day, is that, and also this is part of President Trump's policy. A weakening dollar is President Trump's policy. If you look at the administration's writings prior to them coming to power, they were very, very careful in stating that our policy is dollar weakness. So they have been weakening, they have been working to weaken the US dollar, and they have succeeded. I believe it's already been weakened about 9%, 10% already since they took office in late January. And I think it's the largest weakness in 71, I believe, from a quarterly basis. So the issues are that they believe in dollar weakness, and simultaneously every single thing they're doing is threatening our allies who buy our debt on the long side of it. So they're creating an environment where people are asking themselves, is America a credible country to invest in? And do we trust it? And I think that's why the 30-year is saying what it's saying, that a lot of the people who buy our debt are saying, we got to go somewhere else. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't want to be involved in the geopolitical concerns, and we have to invest somewhere else. And I think the 10-year is a current barometer of where we are, not the 30-year anymore, sadly.
Yeah, and that also that we will have to add that to other factors that also fit into uncertainty, like the constant assault on the independence of the Federal Reserve
Right.
and deportation policies that affect sectors like agriculture and construction, on top of the effects of tariffs that we have seen before. So we and contradictory policies, because you see tariffs would actually push in normal conditions to an appreciation of the dollar, and yet the other Trump policies are trying to force a depreciation of the dollar. The in the short term, at least, the tax cuts could also push in that direction to appreciate the dollar. On the other side, they are pushing for a depreciation of the dollar. You see, there is no coherence.
There is no coherence, because they're trying to please every single party, every single member of their base, rather than actually having a cohesive policy. To talk about, for example, farming. Farming is a major issue right now. From January 1st until today, there's 271 or 276 farms that have declared bankruptcy. That is the largest number of bankruptcies in farms since 2021. Right? So, and we're talking about the entire year of 2021, and we're still only halfway through the year. So, I believe that farming is going to become a major issue in the next few quarters because as food supply and as the inability of actually selling internationally becomes an issue, you're going to have the weakest of the weak actually declaring bankruptcy and leaving the market. Right? Now, this allows for larger organizations and larger corporations to come and take over, but we need small farmers. It helps us with the diversity in there. So to affirm what you were saying is that we do not have a coherence in a strategy. We have a large amount of interests, and some of those interests are contradictory, but policies are being implemented no matter what to please the interest at the expense of the American economy.
Wouldn't another factor feeding this uncertainty be the silence of the Democratic Party? Because if you are an economic actor that is trying to plan and you don't know what the alternative is, if Democrats come back to power in 2029, you are on your own, so you don't know how to plan. You have to try to see any other option that implies bypassing the United States, right?
If you're an external economy, that's true, right? If you're Europe, if you're Canada,
Mhm.
if you're Mexico, you're looking at what other economies can we go ahead and trade with, and what other economies could we get stronger with. I mean, I believe that China and Mexico are actually having talks to create a free trade agreement. If that happens, that would be a very, very big issue for the United States long term. Uh, so especially for the manufacturing of intermediary goods, that's going to become a major issue. But I think that from the Democratic Party side, you're absolutely right. There is no strong challenge to the Republicans, but also they're a minority. They have almost no power, right? The
No, they
only
have
power they would have,
they
the
have
only power they would have is to come on TV and just berate and argue, but there's no cohesive policy. And I think that to a certain degree, the Democratic Party is part and parcel of the labor unions and the interest groups that they are part of, and they want to go back to a status quo. So they don't want to change the economy. They want to go back to the status quo. And if you think about it, that's what President Biden was all about, right? When President Biden was being elected and he ran against President Trump, is let's go back to the status quo. And the Democratic Party has to understand is the status quo will no longer work for most Americans.
Yeah, that's correct. That's how the reason they are playing that is precisely because they want to please, they want to pander to all the bases they had before Trump. not realizing that there has been a reaccommodation on the political landscape that may leave them because they are taking for granted that they are going to capitalize on the fall of Trump's popularity, but that may not end up coming being true.
I think they have failed twice in that, right? I think Hillary Clinton failed in that, and then Kamala Harris failed that in that theory. Is that no matter whatever he does, he will eventually fail, and he did not fail in popularity. He actually gained popularity between elections, right? The issue is that you have to have cohesive policies that talk to the American people, and we are already seeing, for example, think of it also the party. Talk about the Democratic Party. Think of what's going on in New York City with the mayor's race, where you have establishment Democrats losing to a socialist, social democrat. So
Mhm,
that's where the American people are going to end up going, unfortunately, if the Democratic Party does not take reins and create a cohesive policy. We're going to go. Certain cities may go end up going far left.
mhm. So I would like to finish this interview by giving you the last word so you can bring visibility on any issue you believe that needs to receive more attention that is being neglected by the media because the media is neglecting lots of important things. So please, if you could share with us what is your take on this.
So I personally think that the next couple of quarters are going to be a challenging quarters for the U.S. economy. I think that the challenges that the U.S. economy is going to face, it's a an attempt to obtain new loans on existing commercial real estate, and that's leading to major issues. If you look at commercial real estate, you have larger, you have lower occupancy rates, and you have lower valuations than what they were before, and lower cash flows. So that's all forcing massive write-downs. I think that is working through itself through the system, and I think that as it works through the system, is going to have some effects, marginal effects on the U.S. economy, but it's going to have impacts on credit and maybe even credit tightness, especially as it relates to real estate. If you add up to that um, the residential real estate, which is also starting to deteriorate. One of the numbers I just recently heard, I wasn't able to fact check it, but I heard um, is that 60% of FHA loans are delinquent today, which is at a high of the 2008 financial crisis. So if that is true, then this is going to have a massive effect on residential real estate. And you're going to see defaults on residential real estates increase. And we're going to have a financial crisis like we did in 2008, 2009. Maybe not as large, but we would see a big movement. It's critically to understand that in many major markets, residential real estate has increased by 30 some odd percent in the past 5 years, which is unprecedented in American history to see such a major increase in valuation. And that's one of the things that was fueled by cheap money, by COVID money that was pumped through the system. So if you look at those two elements, and then you look at the car market, and you see that the amount of car delinquencies is at a high, you can start seeing that there's going to be major effects on the credit markets in one way or the other. And once that unwinds and it makes it through to the derivative markets, I think the implications and factors are going to be larger. I think that that and the policies of a Federal Reserve that could be a person that is very close to Trump policy, which says we don't care what the independence of the Fed is, but we care what the president does. We could be in a situation that's very similar to Turkey and what Erdogan did when he took over, which is massive hyperinflation, massive level of pumping, and an economy that staggers internationally. So that could be something that happens, and I'm truly worried about that. Now you add to that elements of student debt that are coming on becoming delinquent. You're starting to see that the debt markets are could be challenged in the next few quarters in a very, very massive way from almost every single angle.
And
And that is worrying to me.
we don't even have to go as far as Turkey. We have to go just back to the Nixon era, just
Correct.
before his re-election, where he got a compliant, obedient Federal Reserve chair that manipulated the interest rates to improve his re-election chances. But that brings me to another concern, that is the Scott Bessent push for the regulation in the banking industry, which comes at a terrible time, because many of these banks are going to have to reprice many of their assets with when interest rates may not fall as fast as they expect, and then that's going to put lots of unrealized losses in their budgets. Mid-Zero, I believe, has updated a study on this issue. Is that's going to put the banks in a very tight situation. So, in other words, push the government to a bailout.
They will have to, right? Because otherwise it would challenge everything else. And if you look at the overnight markets for the Federal Reserve and how much they have been having to pump money in there because they're having liquidity issues overnight. So we're already seeing the strains of this debt market work its way through the system. I hope I'm wrong. I hope these are anomalies in the system, that they're one-time issues. But every single model you're looking at, that's what it's looking at. And I would argue that with the level of debt that we have today, it would be worse than the 2008 financial crisis, because you're talking about a larger bomb that's going to, a debt bomb that's going to explode. And the only way of solving it is through a Federal Reserve that is willing and able to do it. And if competency is left in market, then we're going to have this is not going to be a short-term issue. It's going to be a prolonged issue in resolving.
Mhm. So there are many structural risks ahead, much uncertainty, and not an alternative on the side of the Democratic Party. That's unfortunately what we have ahead of us. An isolation, because these tariffs and other geopolitical moves, like for instance the case of Brazil, only convince countries that the best way to deal with the United States is going around them.
Correct. And I think that's one of the things that BRICS is all about. BRICS is all about how to circumvent the United States and how to make sure that if you don't align with the US policy, you can still be functionally, financially viable, right? That you're not hit with sanctions, that you can still trade, that you don't have to look at the dollar as the main trade resource. And I think that's what BRICS are doing, is that how do we circumvent the United States? How do we ensure our own sovereignty, economic sovereignty, as it relates to trade, and ensure that we can do what's the best interest for us versus what's the best interest of other powers.
Yeah, which in turn increases the risk, the geopolitical risks, because then bypassing SWIFT is more likely, and rogue actors like Russia are, have more avenues to evade not just the shadow fleet, but also
Right.
alternative currency to evade SWIFT.
Right. So I don't believe that the U.S. currency is going to be in a major structural decline for the next decade. Maybe after the next decade, yes, but in the next decade, the U.S. dollar is still going to be the big boss in town. But yes, you continue these economic sanctions, you continue these economic controls, and you continue every single week coming up with a new way of limiting trade. Other economies are going to for their own sustainability, they're going to find different ways to survive. And their survival mode is to find different institutions to trade under.
Yeah, let me abuse of your patience with
No,
one
no.
more question. Is that another misconception in the press is that they present this issue as if it were the Fortune 400. China wants to be first. China wants to displace the dollar. I don't believe China wants to displace the dollar. So in terms of currency of reserve, they are very pleased having the dollar to play that role because they don't want to have the deficits and the investments in having a deep liquid market for the yuan that would require. What they want is the transaction currency that is enough to create a yuan zone, not to displace the dollar or the euro or anything, but just big enough to create this zone that where can be insulated from American trade policy.
I agree with you 100%. China, if they wanted to become the trade, the capital of choice, they would not put currency controls on. You cannot be a country that wants to be the primer, the prime country of trade in your currency and put massive currency controls in the system. So they are not interested in that as of right now. That could change with time. That could change with political dynamics. But as of right now, there's absolutely no interest for them to become the capital of choice. Now, what they want to do is diminish the foreign currency risk associated with all their trade. They don't want to have, they learned from the Asian financial crisis, and they know they don't want to have dollar denominated debt. Because if they do have dollar denominated debt and the value of the currency dramatically decreases, they are going to be in major issues and they're going to have massive amounts of external debt. So they want all the debt to be in their own currency because they can print as much money as they want to if there are issues associated with that. So for China, it is a defensive mechanism to ensure survivability of their economy more than anything else.
And if there is the threat of sanctions and the SWIFT is still strong, there is always the alternative of gold. Recently, gold has been displacing the dollar a little bit, but it has been displacing the dollar of reserve.
Right. So one of the things that we're seeing is that the Swiss franc is the one that has seen a lot of acquisition power, and obviously that's a reserve currency of if you don't know what the world is going, you always go to the Swiss franc. So we're seeing that happen. But I would argue that they're also starting to look at other means of assets and raw commodity assets and assets and commodities are becoming critically important for them. So they can go ahead and house mass amounts of raw commodity assets domestically and keep their money in that because they know the world requires it. Rare earth minerals, as an example, they develop 90% of of the world's rare earth minerals. If I were them, I would just house it in that because if I have command and control of that system, I control where the global economy is going in terms of technology. So they can play it very smart and very well by having investments in raw commodities rather than just having it in gold or other tertiary investments.
And they would be insulated from American monetary policy and whatever happens with it.
Actually, it would be an inverse relationship. So whatever happens negatively would impact them positively on their balance sheet.
Well, I believe we have had a very interesting conversation. We have addressed issues that are normally aired in conversations because normally the conversation about trade goes through the usual cliches. It has been very informative. So let me see if we could meet again after a couple of weeks, probably after the August 1st, to have a clear idea what's going to be the landscape on tariffs. Because, for instance, in the case of lumber, they have been announced, but nothing in concrete has been pronounced, the same as pharmaceuticals. So every day, we find something new. For instance, like pharmaceuticals and lumber and copper was pretty recently because a month ago, copper had been not, the tariffs on copper have not even been mentioned, right?
That's exactly no. I mean, it's almost like they're waking up and there's interests that are coming to the table every single day, and they're just making it up as they go along. That's what it seems like because there's no cohesive policy. You would have by now a cohesive trade policy, and you don't have it, and that is actually quite scary because it impacts investments.
Okay, so it will be all for now. Thank you very much for your time and for your contribution to this debate. And let's meet again in some weeks.
Look forward to it. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Have a good day.